Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Thursday edition of Point of View, and as you might imagine, we have a lot to cover. I want to focus a little bit of time and attention in this segment on Ukraine. The next segment will get into some other final comments about the State of the Union address, and a few things that I've posted might be helpful to you just to kind of think that through. Then at the bottom of the hour, Aaron Renn will be with us. He's written a piece in First Things, which, by the way, is a great journal. While I'm talking about that, a very good podcast with some of the people there at First Things on some things that I've been speaking on in terms of a survey. But anyway, we'll be talking with him about the Three Worlds of Evangelicalism. I think you will really appreciate that, since he is talking about lots of different kinds of people that we've had on the program who in some ways agree, in some ways disagree with one another. I think it will help kind of set the scene and the stage for the conversation we'll have in the second hour with Michael Craven. He'll be in studio with us. He is the Vice President of Equipping and Mobilization with the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. He's been a co-host with us many different times in different venues, author of a number of books, in particular, probably the best known, Uncompromised Faith, Overcoming Our Culturalized Christianity. And we'll get into how to apply a biblical worldview and what about worldview and how that applies to even some of the things we're talking about. So I think you will appreciate those conversations as well. Well, again, let's focus on Ukraine, and I wasn't planning on starting with this, but maybe it's the best way to set the scene. The United Nations. As a matter of fact, even the editors of the Wall Street Journal said, look, the United Nations is mostly irrelevant these days, but it's still worth noting the dishonor roll on Wednesday's General Assembly vote on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, you would think that a resolution calling for condemnation of Russia and its invasion of Ukraine would be unanimous. And if you thought that, you would be wrong. First of all, there were 4 votes, not counting Russia. We're not going to count Russia in any of this. We know where they would vote, but there were 4 votes that were against it. That would be Belarus, which they refer to as Russia's mini-me, so there you go. Iran, I'll get to that in just a minute. It was Belarus, North Korea, Syria, and Eritrea. But then of those that didn't vote against it, there were 35 nations that abstained, because they just could not bring themselves to say that what Russia did was wrong or evil or worthy of condemnation. And that gets into some of the ones I'm going to talk about. That's Pakistan, that's India, it's China, it's Vietnam, South Africa, Iraq, Iran, and Cuba, to mention just a few of the 35. I love what they say. You know, you have India in that list. And matter of fact, the prime minister aspires to a leadership role in the world, can take pride in meeting the standards of the Pakistani prime minister. And, of course, China, no surprise there. So you cannot get a very sizable number of countries in the world to actually condemn Russia. Now, off the air yesterday, we had a pretty good conversation. Didn't do it on the air, but we've been able to find out of some people who call themselves conservatives, some people who call themselves Christians. I'm not even sure I know the commitments of some of these individuals that have been saying positive things about Vladimir Putin. If you see that on a Twitter post, really take them on. And if you you are aware of anybody from some of these countries, you might ask them, why is it your country, even in the midst of great evil unfolding before our very eyes, could not bring themselves to condemn what Russia is doing right now? Lest you needed any further evidence, let me talk about these vacuum bombs, because we know a lot more about them now. They're thermobaric. And again, these are various multiple rocket launchers. There's been some debate as to whether or not those bombs have been used. And of course, I think everybody, you have, I've got in front of me here a CNN report that came out even Saturday, seeing some of those rocket launchers. You have various statements by the senator from Florida, Marco Rubio, talking about this, and many others. There's two models, TOS-1 and TOS-1A, but these are used, and you've probably seen them if you've looked at any of the pictures, that actually launch these bombs out. And what they do is they spray out something that's a little bit like gasoline and then ignite them, and then they just suck all the air out. So not only, first of all, if you're hit, you're dead, but even if you're nearby, the wave alone will collapse in your lungs and kill you. And these are really intended, quite frankly, to go after citizens. And yesterday, even in the United Nations, let me come back to the United Nations again, our U.S. ambassador, that'd be Linda Thomas Greenfield, declared, quote, Russia has bombed residential apartment buildings. It has bombed sacred burial sites. It has shelled kindergartens and orphanages and hospitals. Russia has spurned mass hunger, caused so many to flee their homes. The latest UN estimates are marching towards 1 million people. We have seen videos of Russian forces moving exceptionally lethal weaponry into Ukraine, which have no place on the battlefield. These include cluster munitions, vacuum bombs, I just mentioned that a minute ago, which are banned, by the way, under the Geneva Convention. And her office later clarified the use of those bombs against civilians is banned under the Geneva Convention. Yes, they are. And I mentioned our booklet, which is now out, and we'll be mailing it to those of you that are donors. This is one I'm holding up for those of you watching online, and it's entitled Just War. And in it, I spend some time talking about the criteria for a just war. And number 7 is non-combatant immunity. If you will allow me to quote from my own booklet, military forces must respect individuals and groups not participating in the conflict. Only governmental forces or agents are legitimate targets. However, killing innocents may be justified under the principle of double effect. Each action has more than one effect, one intentional, one accidental. In other words, if you are bombing and trying to take out a high-value target like a terrorist, sometimes what they will do is hide the terrorists in amongst individuals that are actually non-combatants. That's been used for years in the Middle East. But by and large, we recognize that non-combatant immunity is something that has been part of the Geneva Convention and the rules of war and military conflict. And what you have right now is Vladimir Putin and his generals essentially are guilty of war crimes. And it is unconscionable to me that some people are still unwilling to criticize and condemn what has been taking place in Russia. So we are learning a lot more about this. Amnesty International has confirmed that you have some of these rockets that have been dropping cluster munitions in a nursery, in a kindergarten. You have, of course, these thermobaric weapons, which we have used once or twice in the mountain caves of Al-Qaeda and against the Taliban. But we're talking about using these against civilians who are actually very innocent and should not actually be a military target by any stretch of the imagination. But that shows you the evil empire that Russia really is. Anyway, that is at least a little bit to talk about. Come back from the break. Maybe just a brief comment or two about the economic sanctions, the sad impact that it's having on the Russian people. And so there are a lot of people suffering. Vladimir Putin is not suffering, but almost everybody either in Russia or Ukraine are suffering, different kinds of suffering. But we'll talk about that. Then we'll get back to the State of the Union address right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Let me introduce you to a word that is probably new to you, but will probably be used much more in the future. You know, decades ago when I talked about concepts like secular humanism or the New Age movement on radio, I think most listeners wondered why I was talking about such philosophical concepts. But you know, they soon learned how important they were. The word is panopticon. It is used in 2 YouTube videos I've seen and is used many times in one of the books I'm reading. The idea was formulated by the philosopher Jeremy Bentham, who wanted to construct a way in which a watchman could keep an eye on lots of prisoners in a prison. A central tower was surrounded by cells with a bright light shining from it, so the prisoners were unable to see the watchman. Therefore, they had to assume that they were always under observation. The word panopticon is being used to describe our world of digital surveillance. Now, you might think that this is merely another way to describe Big Brother in the book 1984, but there is a significant difference. The primary tool in that totalitarian state were posters and huge telescreens, which were a constant reminder you were being watched. The Big Brother metaphor fails to capture what is happening in our current age of surveillance. We never know who is listening, or even when they are listening. People in China know the government is watching and listening and even giving them a social credit score. In this country, we know that the government and certain corporations may be watching and listening to us through our phones, our computers, our smartwatches, even through security cameras. But we're never really sure who is watching and when they are watching because we live in a digital panopticon. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
As we've just been talking, it certainly is a matter of prayer in terms of what is happening in Ukraine, but I also want to encourage you to pray for the people in Russia. And I say that because I understand that there is a very significant difference and should be in our minds between leaders and the general population. Sometimes when I talk about China, I try to make it as clear as I can. We're not against the Chinese people, but we are certainly fearful of the impact that the Chinese Communist Party might make. And with these economic sanctions that have been implemented, Steve Cordes reminds us of the fact that really for the first time ever, you now have the Western world aligning to purposely and willfully destroy the currency of a major power, that would be Russia, which is also the most armed nuclear force on Earth. And even after all of the words have been spread around, if you go back in history, even the Nazi regime in World War II did not face, he says, this level of monetary attack. They were able to transact funds and things through, for example, the Bank of International Settlements in Switzerland and places like that. So we are dealing with something which, again, we almost take for granted now. We saw how the other day in Canada, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau could freeze bank accounts, and now because of the unity of all of the various banking interests, we really are able to bring about massive economic sanctions against Russia. But the sad reality is, as he points out, it targets essentially the Russian people rather than Vladimir Putin or the oligarchs or even the war machine. Russian citizens now find themselves with massive runaway inflation. Their wages now become more worthless by the hour. And as currency collapses, what's going to be the impact for a nation of 145 million people? And he goes on to point out that really, if your goal was to starve the war machine, then stop purchasing Russian oil. And that would probably have a much more significant impact. So I want us to understand that as much as we are celebrating in many ways the impact of these sanctions, which have been devastating in Russia in terms of the ruble, at one point it was only worth a penny. It's just amazing what has happened there. I could, for those of you watching online, show you the diagram of the U.S. dollar versus the ruble, and you can see it comes along and then just jumps, just goes straight vertical. And, of course, that's exactly what you would expect to happen during hyperinflation, which is what they are dealing with right now. But it's still a source of some concern that eventually there are going to be the impact on the Russian people, and we've seen this before. After World War I, the desire was to try to bring Germany down to its knees. You saw the hyperinflation in Germany, and what happened next? Well, it ushered in a strongman, in that case, Adolf Hitler, and we paid a price for it as well. So I wish there was a way we could take out the Russian war machine, take out Vladimir Putin, although who knows who's going to replace him. But I'm sad for the Russian people. They may not face the kind of devastation people in Ukraine are facing, but they're facing a lot more than you and I are facing, and it's certainly another matter of prayer. One of the other articles we've posted for you today is All the President's Incoherence. Comes from our good friend Charles Cook, and he just basically said something that we talked about just the other day, and that is the argument being made is that the president was going to use the State of the Union address to reset his presidency after one of the worst years in American history. And I love Charles Cook because he's honest enough to say, I discern no evidence that this is true. Matter of fact, he quotes another one of his colleagues that said, you know, the kind of speech that you heard Tuesday night was the kind of speech that a president who is doing well actually would give because there was no need for a course correction. And so he says, you must assume then that the president, or at least those around him, believe that that is the case. We were even told before the State of the Union address that the president would kind of set aside his Build Back Better agenda and focus on deficit reduction. By the way, he did make a comment that I'm the only president ever to cut the deficit by more than $1 trillion in a single year. Okay, as I've said before, I think presidents sometimes take too much credit for good news and don't get too much blame for bad news. I don't know how much that is the case, but, you know, we'll leave it as it is. But if for no other reason, just for my producer, I love this line next that comes from Charles Cook. He says, the singer David Bowie likes to write lyrics on cutting up various scribble notes on pages, and then he cuts them up and throws them wildly in the air and then reassembles them at random. I did not know that, by the way. I'm not the music aficionado that Lathan Watts and Steve Miller are, but nevertheless, the bottom line is, he said that's exactly what Joe Biden's speech was like and had the same kind of tone. So there you go. David Bowie throwing notes in the air and making a song out of it because, again, he tried to just jump from one thing to another. Again, we'll give credit for the fact the president did talk about the whole issue of Ukraine. Let's give credit where credit is due. But then instead of talking about Build Back Better, Built in America, and Build Better, and a number of other little phrases that he was trying to develop, certainly were all suggestions that maybe there were some attempts to repackage and reformat. But this idea that there would be a reset in the Biden administration, I think we all pretty much understand that that did not take place. By the way, almost everybody's having a little bit of fun at the president's expense when he's talking about that Putin would never gain the hearts and souls of the Iranian people when he meant the Ukrainian people. And I just can't resist this one because Elon Musk, you got to love this guy because he may be very wealthy and he may be somewhat perhaps disconnected from the political process, but not entirely, because there was a tweet that was put out during the State of the Union address that said Ford is investing $11 billion to build electric vehicles, creating 11,000 jobs across the country. GM is making the largest investment in history, $7 billion to build electric vehicles, creating 4,000 jobs in Michigan. Well, Elon Musk just could not let that go. So he posted a piece right after it saying Tesla has created over 50,000 U.S. jobs building electric vehicles and has invested more than double GM and Ford combined. And then just as a little bit of a jab, he says, quote, FYI to the person controlling this Twitter. Meaning, I don't think Joe Biden wrote this. We know some of the Twitters in the past posts and the tweets were written by, of course, Donald Trump. I suspect most of these were written by someone else. But I thought it was kind of interesting that he just kind of poked him in the chest a little bit. While you're talking about Ford and GM and all these companies building electric vehicles, once again, Joe Biden cannot bring himself to say the name Elon Musk or Tesla or anything like that. And of course, you probably understand why. Elon Musk has, of course, reacted to a number of comments as well about by various individuals in the United States Senate. And so, of course, you're going to expect some back and forth between Elizabeth Warren and Elon Musk, and here maybe trying to develop a little back and forth between Joe Biden and Elon Musk. So great material and just a good illustration as well of the fact that people were paying attention, but you weren't even getting the whole story even from the President's State of the Union address last night. Even when he talks about the Green New Deal, he keeps ignoring the individual that has produced more electric cars than anybody else so far. Just before we take a break, though, we're going to spend some time talking with our friend Aaron Renn, and then later in studio with Michael Craven. My commentary today has the word that might be a little confusing to you. Panopticon. You might say, what is that? Well, that was an attempt back, actually almost 2 centuries ago, to figure out how you could, in maybe a prison, have surveillance of individuals when people wouldn't know how you were actually surveilling them. And, of course, that was developed in an attempt to try to deal that issue with Jeremy Bentham and others. But now many people have used the term to talk about what you might call digital panopticon or digital surveillance. And it's an attempt to realize that the big brother metaphor works, but not as well, because really we just never know who's listening and when they're listening. And so it probably fits a little better to talk about this digital world of surveillance as being kind of a digital panopticon. Anyway, it's a new word for you, and it also, I think, is something that's showing up in the literature. And as we start seeing trends in language or in conversations or philosophy, I always like to talk about it here on Point of View. So that's my commentary today. You might want to read it, pass it on to some others. When we come back, we're going to talk about the three worlds of evangelicalism. All that coming up right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, at Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
One of the articles we've posted came from First Things, and it is entitled The Three Worlds of Evangelicalism. And Aaron Renn has written this, and he is an opinion leader, an analyst, a consultant, speaker, writer on really the whole issue of what's happening in our cities. And you are perhaps familiar with the Manhattan Institute, since we've interviewed many people from that organization. He is a senior fellow there and actually contributes and is the contributing editor for their magazine, which is City Journal. This one, of course, appears in First Things, which is also an outstanding journal. And he spent before that about 15 years in a business career and writes on these different issues. And if you'd like to know more about him, we have a link to aaronrenn.com. You don't even have to know how to spell his name because we have posted it there. Also have, of course, a link to firstthings.com and this particular article. So, Aaron, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks for having me on. I can tell you, I actually am no longer full-time with the Manhattan Institute, but I am still a writer for City Journal.
Well, there you go. Okay, so I do have a link to your website, and so
Great.
I will make sure that people still go to City Journal, and, of course, I love the Manhattan Institute, and, of course, we have a link to your website. But let's see if we can maybe break this into threes. One, you start off with three distinct stages of kind of American secularization. Then you kind of break it into the different worlds and strategies into each one. So again, we're going to talk about the positive world, neutral world, and negative world. But again, if we use your dates, and you recognize that they can move a little bit, before 1994, probably fair to say that the society was generally positive towards Christianity and Christians, and then from 1994 to about 2014, more neutral, since that time negative. And I think most people would accept that general overview. So how do we then think about how the evangelical world has interacted with that? Because we have many of the people that you quote on this particular piece are people we've had on the program every day. And I recognize they don't always necessarily agree with each other. Matter of fact, sometimes they don't play together very well either. But the bottom line is these, I think, give us an idea of how this unfolded. So let's break it into threes. What happened and what kind of strategies existed before 1994?
Sure. Pre-1994, going back to about the 1960s, there was sort of a decline in the status of Christianity in society. So the high watermark of church attendance in the United States was the 1950s. But with the upheavals of the 60s, the sexual revolution, declines in church attendance, there was really a sense that Christianity was sort of losing its hold on society, on the masses. And out of that came two different streams of evangelical response. One was the seeker sensitivity movement, pioneered by people like Bill Hybels at Willow Creek Church or Saddleback Church down in Orange County. And what this really was an attempt to create a more consumer-friendly church to get people coming in the door, because these people saw that folks were not coming in the door. You couldn't just post a bulletin right on the front of the church and expect everybody to be there. So they started creating these very informal liturgies, contemporary music, et cetera, that we've come to know as today basically your suburban kind of non-denominational evangelical megachurch. The second stream that came out of that was what I call the culture war strategy. You could call it the religious right. You could call it a lot of other things. These are people who are alarmed by the sexual revolution, alarmed by other trends in society, and they decided that they were going to fight back and try to take back the culture. So this would be people like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, for example, be two of the bigger figures there. And that movement, was very big, especially in the 80s and in the early 90s. And, of course, is still around today, obviously.
But again, I think what's kind of interesting is you make a distinction, and I think this is very relevant because we sometimes talk about the culture war. As a matter of fact, one of the articles I've posted here is about the attempt now for some of the people in the Democratic Party to say, we were not part of the culture war. But you moves from this idea of culture war to then when we move into this neutral world of 1994 to 2014, not so much talking about culture war, but cultural engagement. And that's a phrase that many of our guests have used on the program. Can you explain that difference?
Yes, and this is, a way, an approach that's been around for a very long time. There's different ways of connecting to the culture. But what we saw in the 90s is, people were getting tired of fighting all the time. For example, a lot of people did not feel at home with the very kind of fundamentalist sentiments of a Falwell or a Pat Robertson. We also saw the comeback of the cities, such as New York under Rudy Giuliani. I lived in Chicago at that time, and it just really kind of exploded in development. And so there was this kind of new group of people that were highly educated with more urban sensibilities. And a lot of them said, let's not fight with the culture anymore. Let's try to engage with the culture kind of on its own terms in this pluralistic public square. We believe that Christianity, we can confidently articulate it to the public in this sort of neutral public square in a way that's compelling, even in this era that's less Christian dominant. And that had a lot of success. And again, is still ongoing in certain circles.
Well, and again, Tim Keller fits into that category. Ben Sass, Senator Ben Sass, and some of those, and Andy Crouch, all of whom been on the program in the past, and a good illustration of that as well. But then you start moving into a little different, and this gets into, of course, the conversations we've had with Rod Dreher. First, the Benedict option, but even now, live not by lies, because there are some that are simply saying, well, I'd like to engage with the culture, but if I look at what has happened in this country, and I interview people that used to be in Poland, Ukraine's in the news right now, or maybe Belarus or Russia itself or Hungary, they come over here saying, you know what, I'm pretty much seeing here unfolding in the United States some of the kinds of things that I saw behind the Iron Curtain. And so that's where at least the people like Rod Dreher and others talk about maybe we need to just kind of pull back and not even necessarily talk about cultural engagement, but try to maintain kind of our biblical orthodoxy in a world that now kind of gets into your third idea of a negative world is going to be more and more hostile to our faith. Is that fair?
It's not that Christians are persecuted, and I want to make that very clear. This is not yet persecution, and hopefully never will be persecution of the type people in, say, China might experience. Yet we can see that increasingly, secular society basically views Christianity, Christians, and certainly Christian moral norms as sort of a threat to the new public order. And you can find yourself getting in trouble or getting canceled very easily. And, I used you could use the example going back, was it Phil Robertson from Duck Dynasty who got attacked back for in the 2013-14 over some of his beliefs. Similarly, Jason and David Benham, the Benham brothers, had a HGTV show canceled out from under them in 2014 because of their outspoken Christian beliefs. I think even Chip and Joanna Gaines in their show got attacked over it. So this idea that you can just hold views that would have been maybe not popular in Manhattan, but normal Christian beliefs about a lot of things, now, you hold to those, you can get yourself in trouble if you happen to work for a Fortune 500 company or, a major, Wall Street firm or something like that, or your entertainment or the media space. It's not that everybody's getting canceled or everybody's getting attacked, but I think that we can see from these cases and from this cancel culture that's out there that there is more risk than there has been before. And Rod has really been on top of this for a long time. He was, I think when he wrote the Benedict option, a lot of people didn't like it, but maybe it was a little too early. People weren't ready to buy it yet. But I think people are now starting to pay more attention to it. And I do think it's interesting. He's Eastern Orthodox and came out of a Catholic background before that. So a lot of what he says isn't really phrased to resonate with evangelicals. But that's really the only serious engagement with this new world that I've seen is coming from him. And again, a lot of evangelicals didn't like it. Kind of what I see is most of these different tribes have sort of doubled down on what they were doing before, only, it's sort of evolved, maybe I call it deforming under some of the pressure.
Sure. Let me take a break, and when we come back, we'll see if we can improve the audio there. But I thought one of the examples that, as we're going to the break, that was most striking is that Tim Keller's been on the program with us before, was supposed to receive an award from Princeton Seminary. Again, an individual who's been a pastor in New York City, probably not exactly identified by most people as a fundamentalist, but nevertheless, even though he was slated to receive the Abraham Kuyper Award, was not able to receive those. Did give a lecture, but it's illustration again that you can be even somebody who is not seen as that extreme from a secular point of view, but all you have to do is disagree with one small part of the woke theology and you get disinvited. Anyway, we'll take a break, talk a little bit more about this issue with Aaron Renn right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and then next hour we're going to have Michael Craven in studio with us, Vice President of Equipping and Mobilization with the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, and the author of a book we talked about years ago, Uncompromised Faith, Overcoming Our Culturalized Christianity. In some respects, this conversation right now with Aaron Renn is a perfect setup for some of the conversation we're going to have about having an orthodox theology, developing a biblical worldview, and how to apply that to various areas of life. Aaron, Aaron, we've been talking about, first of all, the positive world pre-1994, a neutral world 1994 to 2014, and then since that time, since 2014, a negative world. A couple of things happening in the world that we find ourselves in today. Of course, we have the idea of cultural engagement, still talk about that, but you also talk about this idea of, if you will, synchronization, and then we'll even get into those who have decided to leave the church, because that's been another whole issue as well. But this idea of a cultural synchronization is even different than the idea of cultural engagement, isn't it?
Yes. What I observed is these different groups, as they've evolved, they've continued doing what they were doing before, but they've sort of, I call it deformed. Maybe that's not the best word for it. For example, the culture war people, previously you would have said they were very concerned about moral uprightness in political leaders. And yet most of them supported Donald Trump, who certainly does not adhere to Christian morality in his personal life in many respects. So they sort of abandoned that. And with the cultural engagers, I think what we've seen is maybe synchronization, and maybe too tough a word, but what I started noticing was they talk about almost exclusively the issues that secular society wants to talk about. Especially like immigration, refugees, racism. Those have become the things that they talk about overwhelmingly. And, when it comes to, say, abortion issues, you'll now hear people talk about being, quote, holistically pro-life, and say, well, we have to emphasize, care for single mothers. We have to emphasize families separated at the border. These are all life issues. Sort of downplaying, maybe downplaying the actual abortion aspect of it a bit. Again, that's not everybody, but that's certainly some of it. And then, as you noted, there's kind of been this growth of this, kind of call it progressive, evangelical, or even ex-evangelical world, in which many people, or certainly some vocal people, have kind of left the faith and, maybe even turned against evangelicalism, some of them over bad experiences with purity culture or various different things. But that's another trend that I see out there.
One of the other ones you talk about is a stream which involve those drawn from various other movements who have become progressively more, progressive, I guess would be a good way to put that, become part of the Christian left. So either they sort of left evangelicalism, or in many cases they've deconstructed their faith, which I always get a kick out of that phraseology, and have left Christianity behind. And that includes some people we've had on this program who used to be individuals we interviewed in the 1980s or 90s who said, I'm not so sure I necessarily believe the Bible any longer. Part of it has to do because sometimes it's some of the other issues you talked about, but lots of times they're LGBTQ kind of issues. And that has been, I think, also a troubling trend as well, to see individuals that wrote sometimes best-selling books on Christianity that now don't even necessarily claim to be Christians. Right.
I think, as you say, a lot of this among the kind of the ex-evangelicals, a lot of it is driven by, a desire to be LGBT affirming. And so they basically view evangelicalism or even, Christianity as essentially not compatible with that. But certainly that's a big driver. But even within the people who would still consider themselves, kind of conservative evangelicals, the way that those issues are talked about now is quite different than they were before. So you'll hear quite a bit about how, the church has failed to create a welcoming environment for gays. A lot about, affirming the innate sexual orientation that's unchangeable, and that you should not believe that, sanctification will change sexual desires. So I think that even within kind of the more conservative precincts of evangelicalism, this one is something of a trend as well. And again, it's understandable because it's one of the flashpoint issues of society. I think when it comes to abortion, opposition to abortion is sort of a little bit grandfathered in, if you will, because it's been out there so long, and the public has never really fully embraced abortion in the way that it's essentially, kind of embraced some of these other sexuality issues. So that's definitely something that's going on out there.
One of the last things I would say is, again, I certainly do agree that we've moved from a time in which Christianity was positive to one where there are as many young people now wondering not only whether Christianity is true, but whether Christianity is good. And it seems to me that we're just changing the culture into which we're ministering. And the example I love to use in the book of Acts, in Acts 13, when the Apostle Paul is in the synagogue, can he assume everybody's Jewish? Yes. Can he assume everybody believes in God? Yes. Can he believe that and assume that everybody has read the Old Testament? Yes. They're looking for a coming Messiah. So he can kind of hit the ground running. And that, in some respects, reminds me of an America not so long ago where you could say, this is wrong because the Bible says it's wrong. Now we live in a world that's more like Acts 17, where the Apostle Paul finds himself in Athens with Stoic and Epicurean philosophers. He really has to sort of make the case. And today, I think it's going to be more important than ever, as we try to talk about here in terms of evangelism, apologetics, and even our conversation next hour with Michael Craven of Worldview, to really argue to your biblical convictions rather than to argue from your biblical presuppositions, because we just are in a world where there is much more questioning, maybe even hostility to Christianity. And that's in some respects why I thought your piece was so good, because also you name names. You can kind of figure out who's on which team, and I can't tell the game without a scorecard. So you gave us some of that information as well. But just before we let you go, I did mistakenly put you part of the Manhattan Institute, but I do have a link to aaronrenn.com, and I would imagine that many of our listeners would really appreciate some of the things you're writing about in terms of various places in the country, especially for our listeners in Kansas City and Indianapolis and other places which you've written about. So if people are interested in this whole idea of urban renewal and ministry and those kinds of things, what will they find when they land on your website?
Cities and kind of Rust Belt economies and how we turn that around. I saw that a lot of these issues people thought were sort of left behind. As we were concentrating on these coastal cities, all these other areas were not getting the attention that they deserved. But now they sort of are. After Donald Trump's election, people looked up and said, oh, my goodness, we have to pay attention to what's happening in Youngstown. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about those kinds of places and how to turn them around.
So again, just great material. And again, we have a link to Aaron with 2 A's, Renn, 2 N's, .com. And again, you don't have to remember all that. It's on the website. And most importantly, I do want to point you to First Things, the Three Worlds of Evangelicalism. So Aaron, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks for having me.
When we come back from the break, we're going to have our good friend Michael Craven in studio. What about worldview? We need a robust Christian worldview, if you will. We need a public theology. Talking a little bit about this idea of Christian engagement, cultural engagement. We even talked about the idea of culture wars, and that's one of the articles we've posted here today. So you have some great material. I also have posted a podcast in which they were interviewing Michael Craven about worldview in use. So you have that material and all sorts of other resources that are available. So let's take a break. Don't forget my commentary out today. Lots of great information for you to print out, to read, and to pass on to others. We'll be back right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I think y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we're going to focus our time and attention back on this idea of Christian worldview. How many times have we used that phrase over the last 50 years? Now celebrating the 50-year anniversary of Point of View. Started in 1972 by Marlon Maddox, and of course we have been carrying this on ever since. We'll be receiving an award next month at the National Religious Broadcasters Convention. Actually, next week, I should say, since we now are in March. And again, worldview is very important. So when you talk about worldview, certainly one of the people I like to bring into the microphone is Michael Craven, who's the Vice President of Equipping and Mobilization at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. Also oversees the Colson Fellows Program. I do want to talk about that because I have met many people that have graduated from that. We've had him on over the years, including talking about his book, Uncompromised Faith, Overcoming Our Culturalized Christianity. Michael Craven, always great to have you in studio.
Kerby, it's been a while. It's great to be here.
Yeah, I know. I was thinking sometimes you and I cross paths at a conference center, and so I'm getting an update on your kids, and I hadn't seen the kids since then, but I have seen you a couple of times since then. But for just a few minutes before we get into this whole idea of worldview, which will fill very well some of the conversation we had last hour with Aaron Renn, you are head of the Colson Fellows Program, and that's one of the reasons why our good friend John Stonestreet hired you, and that is an incredible program. I've met all sorts of graduates, but let's encourage some of our listeners who really want to dig deeper and apply a Christian worldview to every area of life to know more about the program.
Yeah. Well, as you know, Chuck Colson, one of his passions was the realization that too many Christians lacked an understanding of Christian faith as a comprehensive life system, a means by which you could analyze the world around you, accurately interpret the world around you. And so 18 years ago, he started what was then known as the Centurions Program.
Right.
And it was designed to really focus on Christians who were serving in the commanding heights of culture and bring them into a 12-month deep dive into Christian worldview or public theology so they could begin to understand how Christianity shapes and interprets everything in life and reality, and that it establishes and gives credence to God's creational norms, that everything in life is intended and designed to function in a particular way. And as the philosopher once said, if you go against the grain of the universe, you are going to get splinters. And oftentimes we find ourselves going against the grain of the universe, in large part because even as Christians, we don't possess this Christian life and worldview. We think we do because we're Christians and we've read the Bible. But Christian worldview is often made difficult because it's that which is frequently derived of those things that are implied in Scripture and not necessarily explicit. So you have to develop a worldview from those core doctrines, and take from, say, for example, the Imago Dei, and from that you can, by implication, develop a theory or philosophy of economics.
Right.
So that's not easy.
No, not easy. And again, whether you talk about medical ethics or economics or political theory or whatever, those are things which deserve and need some kind of fleshing out, and that's kind of what you do. Now, the program that I was aware of was 12 months, and it was one where there was a fair amount of reading, and it was fairly small. But you were telling me the number of individuals now that are in the program, so this has expanded dramatically.
It has. We changed the way we deliver the program. historically, people would gather 3 times a year in Washington, D.C., in large part because they wanted to hang out with Chuck Colson.
Yes.
But after Chuck's death, we took a brief hiatus and renamed the program in his honor, the Colson Fellows Program.
Mm-hmm.
And 3 years ago, when I came on board, we made the decision to re-engineer how we deliver the program and moved away from the national model and toward this regional small cohort model. So we now have regional cohorts in 62 cities across the country. We have online cohorts in all major time zones. We have 7 international cohorts. And this affords people the opportunity to, while they're going through the program, which begins in July and concludes each May, they gather each month in their local cohort to review, process, verbally process with their fellow students what they're learning, what they're reading. They'll read about 13 books throughout the course of that season.
Yes.
Daily devotions. They meet with some of the authors of those books in live webinars, get to interact with them. And what's interesting to me is we ask people, why did you enroll in the program? And inevitably the answers are, well, I wanted to learn about worldview, wanted to learn about apologetics. In other words, it was a pursuit of knowledge, acquisition of knowledge. And we asked, did it meet those expectations? We never get, well, I learned about worldview and I learned about apologetics. They do, but the language becomes much more transformational. Mm-hmm. This changed my life.
Yes.
Because what it does is it enlarges the story of what God is actually doing in the world.
Yes.
And they find their part in it.
Now, I might just mention we have a link to colsonfellows.org, so if people find themselves wanting to connect. And what I love about that is it's gain wisdom, live faithfully, act courageously. And it's interesting, Michael, over the last year, I've said that one of the words that keeps surfacing time and time again is the need for discernment, or, of course, that would be biblical wisdom. Yeah. And then it's become even more obvious, and we talked about the idea of Rod Dreher, live not by lies, acting courageously. So the words discernment and courage surface so often. So it shows, again, how the Colson Fellows program is hand in glove with the kinds of things we're trying to do here. But you do have a place where you're face-to-face so they can live faithfully, because that's part of it as well. And so people come for the knowledge. They leave because they have a transformed life, right?
Right.
Yeah. So anyway, great material. If just before we take a break, since I got a minute or two, and then I want to get into worldview, if somebody says, wait a minute, I'd be interested in this, there's a place where you can register for informational webinar. Unfortunately, some of those are vanishing, but not that one, because that's March 14th. So there's a real opportunity if you're listening today. Now, no goofing around, because you only have a couple of days to get this ready, but on Monday, March 14th, there's a webinar to really give people some information. Talk about that.
That's right. It's when I meet with folks who gather via webinar from all over the country and walk them through in very direct terms what the program involves. It is a significant commitment. It is a very rigorous program. But some people will think, therefore, is it for me?
Yes.
I'm not an academic. I'm not a scholar. It is designed for working people, busy people, Christians who desire to grow in wisdom and knowledge. And we really don't approach the teaching of worldview as a polemic, but really as wisdom, equipping Christians with this analytical skill, this ability to discern what is true and good and beautiful, and walk them through that. We stop receiving applications as of June 1st. And as I said this year, I think I may have said, we've got almost 800 people in the program this year.
Unbelievable. Yeah. Just incredible. We're going to take a break. When we come back, let's talk about worldview. You're familiar with Francis Schaeffer used to say that Christians would perceive the world in bits and pieces. And what about this idea of a comprehensive worldview, having a good public theology, really, in a sense, the full faith and witness of the church? Those are some topics we're going to get into. And if you'd like to join the conversation at any point, feel free to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. I suspect most of you are just going to get out your pen, start writing down. And maybe you might want to find out a little bit more about the Colson Fellows program. We'll take a break and continue with our good friend Michael Craven right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Let me introduce you to a word that is probably new to you, but will probably be used much more in the future. You know, decades ago when I talked about concepts like secular humanism or the New Age movement on radio, I think most listeners wondered why I was talking about such philosophical concepts. But you know, they soon learned how important they were. The word is panopticon. It is used in 2 YouTube videos I've seen and is used many times in one of the books I'm reading. The idea was formulated by the philosopher Jeremy Bentham, who wanted to construct a way in which a watchman could keep an eye on lots of prisoners in a prison. A central tower was surrounded by cells with a bright light shining from it, so the prisoners were unable to see the watchman. Therefore, they had to assume that they were always under observation. The word panopticon is being used to describe our world of digital surveillance. Now, you might think that this is merely another way to describe Big Brother in the book 1984, but there is a significant difference. The primary tool in that totalitarian state were posters and huge telescreens, which were a constant reminder you were being watched. The Big Brother metaphor fails to capture what is happening in our current age of surveillance. We never know who is listening, or even when they are listening. People in China know the government is watching and listening and even giving them a social credit score. In this country, we know that the government and certain corporations may be watching and listening to us through our phones, our computers, our smartwatches, even through security cameras. But we're never really sure who is watching and when they are watching because we live in a digital panopticon. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Michael Craven with us. How do we talk about a worldview? How do we develop a worldview? And how do we make it in such a way that is comprehensive? We talk about this idea of really wanting to bring the whole counsel of God to our conversations. But Michael, you spend time every day thinking about worldview and teaching it. So give us some ideas about how we get started in that regard.
Well, you know, it takes me back to about 21 years ago when I made this transition from the corporate world into, I would add, drag kicking and screaming
I do remember
this world of vocational ministry. And actually, it was a conversation with you. We were talking about worldview. I had been deeply influenced by Francis Schaeffer. And I thought, you know, like many people, why have I never been taught this?
Yes.
And you said something to me that still resonates with me to this day, and that is so many Christians treat Christian worldview as an elective of the Christian faith. And I don't think at that time either of us could have imagined where we would be 20 years later in terms of our culture. And so what may have been a very insightful comment has really pinpointed a crisis in the church. We really don't understand Christianity as a public truth, and we don't know how to articulate that truth. In many instances, we have reduced Christianity to really, if we're honest, what the first century would think of as a personal salvation cult that has little or no substance or inquiry or questions or advice or answers to anything other than how do I go to heaven when I die.
And Peter Berger, I think, used to say that it's it was Theodore Roszak. It's privately engaging but socially irrelevant.
Yeah.
And when you talk about this idea of public theology, people go, what? How does that even fit? Because my Christianity fits my family, maybe even my church, but I have some real hesitation about bringing it into the boardroom, the courtroom, or the classroom. Yeah. And yet that's where it really needs to thrive.
Yeah, it does. And what we saw in the 20th century was really the privatization of Christian faith. And this has been disastrous. People look around and many Christians look around and they're deeply, rightly concerned about the state and direction of our culture. And their assumption inevitably is that this is the consequence of a secular occupation. We've been overthrown. Mm-hmm. I would argue that it is more accurately the result of the Christian evacuation.
Yes, well said.
And it's primarily an intellectual evacuation. We privatize the Christian faith to nothing more than personal salvation. We abandon all of our responsibilities to seek first the kingdom of God, and we don't even understand what the kingdom of God is anymore.
Yes, well, and that's part of the problem. I mean, if you say kingdom, people say, well, that's in the future. And right. How does that relate to the kinds of things maybe you're even teaching the fellows? Because I think your tendency is to think, I have my job over here. Matter of fact, I'm going to take some phone calls in just a minute, and they'll talk about what they did in their job, perhaps, but also how do I deal with my family. But Christianity really doesn't relate to my job, but it relates to all the other aspects of my life once I leave my job and go home. But that's a dichotomy, a secular split that we need to actually address too, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I think if we contrast the church today with the church in the first century, today we're focused on getting people to invite Jesus into their lives, to share the quote-unquote gospel. The early church, their proclamation was Christ is King.
Yes.
Followed by Caesar is not. So there was a profoundly political element, not in the statist sort of view of politics that we have today, but that the kingdom of God was the government of God that Christ was bringing to bear upon the earth. And this for them was great news. It was glorious news. Mm-hmm. And they understood that it was, in a sense, bringing forth a new social order over and against the pagan social order that was so corrupted, so broken, so evil and destructive, that God was making all things new in Christ Jesus through the advance of his kingdom. And as his kingdom advanced, he was forming the ecclesia, the people of God. And they were to participate in the advance of this new social order, not by triumphalism or conquest, but by living a different ethic, by demonstrating to a watching world this is what life looks like under the rule and reign of Christ. And that implies a worldview, a new way of seeing the world, of understanding human sexuality, of understanding marriage and human relationships, of understanding women, of understanding parenting, of understanding morality, ethics, rescuing the abandoned children of Rome. These were all radical things in contrast to Roman culture that were shaped by what we now refer to as a Christian worldview.
We've talked with Dr. Rodney Stark about the idea of triumph of Christianity, and he tries to explain early on why is it that this Jesus cult became so successful, and that's because the Christians were so different. They treated their families different, they treated the poor differently, and most importantly, they were willing to die for their faith, and pagans looking in are going, I wouldn't go die for a pagan God that I believe in. And so in some respects, the world was so divided, it was easy to recognize if you were a Christian, whether you were a Christian, because you were acting so differently than anything in that Roman Empire. But now that Christianity has kind of leaked into almost every area of society, now it's starting to advance. One of the individuals I know that you work with at the Colson Center, who's one of the speakers at the Colson Fellows, is Glenn Sunshine, Dr. Glenn Sunshine. I've been in his church in Connecticut and others, and he says, really, if you want to understand the Western world, it's Rome plus Christianity. You take Christianity out, and we're back to Rome, aren't we? And in some respects, people are just shocked at the barbarism, but in some respects, it makes it easier to figure out if you're a Christian or not, because you're saying, I don't want to go this direction that our culture is going once the veneer of Christianity has been stripped away.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's an important point. Everything that I'm saying might lead one to think that I am pessimistic about the future, when actually the opposite is quite true. I am more optimistic about the state of the church in America than I have ever been, in large part because I think the curtain is being pulled back. And God is doing amazing things to and through his people because of what is happening in the culture. We're starting to ask questions we should have been asking a century ago. And God is moving and reviving and strengthening. And you're absolutely right. The line of demarcation is becoming very, very clear. It will soon be untenable for people to pretend to be a Christian. And so that will result in the death of cultural Christianity, and it needs to die.
Let's take a break, but before we do so, let's take a phone call. And since some of the calls are coming in, 1-800-351-1212. We'll head up to Ohio first. And Roger, I thank you for calling today. I think you have actually been teaching and wanted to share something with our listeners today.
Well, I have had a little bit of teaching. My background's electronics, but I first want to say that we often insult God by the fact that we look at history as if we're the only Christians that God's ever worked through. We don't take wisdom from other people, and we don't even take it from Genesis to the book of Revelation of Jesus Christ, which gives us a worldview and a philosophy that should help us deal with anything that comes along. It doesn't make any difference what it is. And that's a sad point. And I say that because I used to deal with things in the way that we've been talking negatively about them, and didn't appreciate the Christians who had something to share. Lots of times there's great works by dead Christians that we can live from, and lots of things we can learn from the early writings, as I like to call them, as well as the latter, and applying those. One of the things that I made comment when I called in was I told the fellow I taught electronics 2 different times, and I used to have my first day of class. I told my students, this is my philosophy class, and I'll try to shorten up 15 to 20 minutes quickly. I told them everybody's got a philosophy. Where you get it from is going to be critical, and how it's going to stand up. You're going to soon learn mine. First off, I think you have very important characteristics. You didn't crawl out from under a rock. You're a created being, and I'm going to work with those from my point of view. I'm going to try to get the best out of you I can, because what I believe the potential that God has put in you, even by your just very fact of being a human being, the highest part of the creative order. And of course, they look at me like I was kind of crazy. But I said, your philosophy checks all of your decisions that you make, and you need to find out, where'd you get it? From music? From your friends? From the bar? How will it hold up if you have a family? We'd be able to handle and pass anything on that's worthwhile. Usually by then I had their attention, and I hit them with a few other points too.
And they probably didn't expect that in an electronics class, but they're getting a heavy dose of worldview. We're coming to a break, but after the break, I wanted to get Michael's comments if we could, because that is a good example. Because when you ask people, where do you get your worldview or your philosophy of life? They go, I don't know. I get some from my parents. I guess I probably do get some from music, television. Hopefully believers get it from the Bible and reading Christian books. And also just talking about reading some of the books by those who are no longer living. I'm a firm believer in the old C.S. Lewis quote. You know where I'm going with that. You know, read 2 old books before you read one new book. You know, some of the greatest wisdom is found in some of those books that people have never read. Well, we're sitting across from a person that has read some of those, and so we'll come back and take some more phone calls. 1-800-351-1212. Michael Craven with us today, and we'll be back right after these important messages.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach. by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, at Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, we'll take some more phone calls in just a minute. 1-800-351-1212. Michael Craven with us today, Vice President of Equipping and Mobilization, of course, at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, but also oversees the Colson Fellows Program. Let me mention again, if you go to the website, which we have linked right now at our website, pointofview.net, you can even watch that webinar, and maybe you or you know somebody that might benefit from the Fellows Program. Please encourage them to maybe just at least check it out and see what they might want to do. Of course, you can sign up to get the Breakpoint commentary that is done by John Stone Street. Of course, you hopefully are already signed up for my commentary, Viewpoints commentary today, on the subject of panopticon, which is a word that most people don't hear, but it illustrates again that somebody is always watching us. It goes all the way back to Jeremy Bentham and the idea of surveillance and the rest. But anyway, let's get back to this. And first of all, Michael, I thought, Roger, what a great way to start, because you would think, oh, obviously we'll talk about philosophy in a philosophy class, maybe even in a political science class. But if you're in an engineering class, you're teaching electronics, there's always an opportunity, isn't there?
Yeah, there is. And I think this is, again, part of what we do. We reduce Christianity to religious matters, private, personal, spiritual matters. But Christianity addresses everything, including electricity, since God is the inventor of electricity, and because God is an ordered God and is the inventor of creation, the creator of all things, his creation is understandable. And this is the genius of Western science. Christianized Western science was they dared to ask the question, what causes or why does a phenomenon occur? No other scientific endeavor ever sought to ask that question. They simply observed phenomenon. So to begin a class on electronics or electricity for electricians, presumably, is actually a brilliant start. Let's talk about the why, the philosophy.
Sure. And our booklet that we have on God and Science gets into that a little bit more. A lot of it goes all the way back to a very famous book that's been out this last couple of years here from Discovery Institute. And again, because you start with the assumption that the universe is created, then it's a contingent universe. It's comprehensible. It's coherent. It's contingent. All the C's that we use sometimes to evaluate a worldview. And that's what led to the rise of modern science. So again, that booklet's also available to you. But let's take some more phone calls along the way. And you are coming on with Michael Craven, who is with, again, the Colson Center, and Martha in Arizona, KNLB. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for taking my call. My question was, we're so isolated and we have so many superficial relationships, and we have for so long as Christians. How do we come out of that? I mean, I love the idea of the fellowship program that you're talking about. And then secondarily, do you think someone who's already working on their master's in divinity would have time to do that at the same time?
Well, as to the first question, gathering in community we find is an incredibly pedagogical advantage, a philosophy of teaching. And the example being that some of the books that we select are intended to challenge people's biases, assumptions, presuppositions. And if you read something in isolation, it's very easy to read and counter those things that challenge you and maintain your biases, maintain your presuppositions. But when you do so in community and you begin to hear from others and how they've interpreted the book or the idea, and you can interact with that idea, sometimes you may discover that your bias is challenged, your presuppositions change, you grow, you learn. That's hard to do in isolation. So it's why we go to the cohort model, the regional cohort model, where people actually gather and meet and process in real time what they're learning. Secondly, if you're going through a master's program and attempt to take on the Colson Fellows program, I would not necessarily recommend that.
There's enough reading there to tank anybody.
That'd be like trying to attempt 2 master's degrees at the same time.
But again, some great resources. I mentioned just a minute ago, here's the booklet on God and Science, and it's based on some kind of a short summary of the God hypothesis by Stephen Meyer. And again, these are only 10-minute reads, but it gets you started, and most of them have a for further reading in the back. Now, this one doesn't because they left it out, but even the most recent one we have now on just war. These are our topics we're addressing every single day, and I think part of what I appreciate so much about the Colson Center, Breakpoint Commentary, as well as all the other resources that you have, even in the Fellows Program, is as soon as people get into your program, they realize, wait a minute, as a Christian, I can think about every area of life. I don't turn off my brain when I go to the movies. I don't turn off my brain when I go and vote. I don't turn off my brain when I watch television or when I read the newspaper or I go on an internet website or listen to music. In some respects, I've had kids when we've taken them through various programs, whether it's the Mind Games program or some of the things that are happening through various ministries as well. Understanding the Times, they said, you kind of ruined it now, because now I'm always evaluating every movie and every musical piece and every book. But that's kind of what we are encouraging people to do, isn't it?
Absolutely. And, I think about point of view, and what you do every day is very similar to what we do at Breakpoint. We're trying to help Christians know what they ought to think from a deeply informed Christian perspective about a given issue in culture. And what we're trying to do with the Colson Fellows Program is teach people how to think. Give them that same ability that they listen to you and they go, well, how does he know all that stuff? Well, I can tell you, you've read a few books, you've spent a little time studying, and this is part of loving the Lord with your mind.
That's right.
And seeking wisdom. And the Lord promises that if you ask for wisdom, he will give it. I will add that he's not probably going to grant you much wisdom if you ask for it and then sit in front of the television all the time. You've got to do your part. You've got to work hard to understand the world around you. And there's tremendous resources available. So,
Michael Craven with us. Let's, if we can, maybe go to someone that actually has been in the program. We'll head up to New Hampshire this time. WSEW and Rob, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yeah, thanks, Kerby and Michael. Glad to see you on the program. So 2 points here. Number one, I'm a graduate of the program back in 2021, and my wife and I, when I was going through the program, she wasn't really connecting on me as I was explaining what we were studying and what the objective was of the program. Well, she went with me down to Wilberforce weekend, down in Dallas-Fort Worth. She was so taken by what went on down there that I was impressed with the speakers, the quality, the energy of that entire weekend, that she subsequently enrolled in the program. So she'll be commissioned in Orlando coming up this May. So the only thing we have to work out is that get straight that I'm still a senior fellow in the household, though. That's the thing.
Well, again, you give us your experience, because, again, some people, when they went through the Centurions program, is a little different, but yours is more recent. So how many books do you think you read, and how did it help your life? Because obviously it's not only what you learned, but how it changed your life. Did you find that to be the case?
Yeah, and I don't want to get off the phone before I bring up a question for Michael, but yes, that's worth discussing, how it changed my life. Yeah, the study part of it was intense. I mean, I'm retired, so I was able to put full time into it. Working full time and doing that program would be a tremendous challenge. But yeah, the books, the reading, it came at you from so many different perspectives and so many different authors and experts in the field that you were really getting a tremendous breadth and depth on Christian worldview and what's going on in the culture. And how it changed my life, though, is the worldview lens now is what I carry with me every day. Mm-hmm. And that's what I want to get into my question. The other thing it did was intensify my desire to continue to learn. So the reading part of it, which is really emphasized, is something now that's just in my DNA. It's been ingrained in me now. So books and all of the literature that's out there, and Kerby, some of the authors that you get on your program, their books have become part of my library as well. So that whole thing emphasized it's a continuous learning process. I think, Michael, you already said that. It's not something you just get a certificate put on the wall. Now you have been commissioned to get out there and get involved in the culture and to continue to educate yourself on what's going on.
So you have a question real quick, because we need to take a break.
Yeah, certainly. So, Michael, you talked about your optimism for the church. Now, anecdotally, my experience has been left the church that we were at after multiple conversations with our pastor about worldview. While he endorsed what I was saying about worldview, there was no tangible movement toward that. He wanted me to teach it, but 7 months went by, and it just pretty much died. And I know there are people in the congregation that were really disconnected from Christian doctrine. Supporters of abortion and the whole LGBTQ movement. Those things were coming in the door. The wokeness is coming in the door. But from the pulpit, there's no declaration about how to engage these cultural issues from the biblical worldview.
Let me put you on hold, and we'll come back and focus a little bit more time and attention on that. If you can stay with us, Rob, we'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Michael Craven in studio with us. And if we don't get to all your questions or comments, we do have a link to, of course, the Colson Center, especially the Colson Fellows Program. But Rob raised a question. I want to get back to him in just a minute. But he talked about pastors. I understand you're doing what I think would be a church affiliation program. Talk about that.
We are. So for the first time in the history of the program, we really wanted to craft the program in such a way that the local church could deliver it in and through their congregation, led by members of their staff who had been trained in the Colson Fellows program. And we've just been amazed at the response of churches. And Rob is right. It either falls into overwhelmingly positive category or an overwhelmingly indifferent category. And what we're seeing is those churches that really are responding to the pressure of their people who desire to understand the times in which we live and know how to live faithfully in those times. Those are the churches where we're seeing leadership really drive the integration of this program into their churches, which is exciting.
Rob, let me come back to you because I kind of picked up that maybe your pastor wasn't on board, but I would say that if you go to different churches around the country, some are and some aren't. And it just seems to me that we just need to have more people listen to these kinds of programs and see the urgency and the need to actually develop a Christian worldview. But any final comments you might have?
No, that's encouraging. I knew about the pastor's program, but I also, Michael, the Barna surveys are somewhat sobering. You're certainly aware of all that data. So my question was, you say that the curtain's been pulled back, but I was just wondering the mechanism by which you see your optimism playing out in the church these days.
Yeah, I think conditions up to this point have been such that it is possible to believe the admonition, peace, peace, when there is no peace. The church has, throughout its history, found itself at odds with the world at war with God. And in America, in a highly Christianized culture, I think it's very easy to fall into this temptation that everything's okay. That being Christian is equivalent to being American or being conservative. But being Christian, being a follower of the Lord Jesus Christ is something far more radical than even that.
Rob, I appreciate you being in the program, and so congratulations to you. And tell your wife we're excited about her. This is really encouraging.
Yeah, you'll be equally yoked now.
Yeah, we hope so. Thank you for the encouragement.
Thank you. We are almost out of time, but I wanted to get into a couple of things. First of all, if people sometimes tune in and tune out, you've done enough radio with me to know. One of the things I did want to mention is we do have a link to colsonfellows.org. And if you might be somebody like Rob that said, I'd kind of like to know about this program, but I'm not ready to sign up yet, you have an informational webinar taking place on Monday, March 14th. And that's something which people can watch on their computer, right?
It is, and I actually lead all those webinars.
So again, we've got that for you. We got all sorts of information and the rest. But are there some particular books or resources you would encourage people to actually get a hold of? Because I find needs at two levels. Number one, the needs at the parent or grandparent level about my kids, my grandkids or my kids. Yeah. They're going off to college. And again, whether you take the programs that we've talked about on this program, for example, like the Mind Games Conference, or you go to all sorts of different programs that are in the Christian schools on understanding the times, and you get some of the material even at the Colson Center. Do something to prepare them. And so that's the biggest crisis need. As a matter of fact, when I first joined Pro Ministries back, it was almost 50 years ago now, but when we did, we had a little brochure. When your kids go off to college, will they lose their faith? Well, that was true back in the 1970s. It's really true today. The other crucial need is for somebody that maybe is in an area of ministry that they have never really been prepared for, or an area of their business where they don't know how to integrate their Christianity. And so I'd say both of those are really good candidates for some of the things that are available through the Colson Center.
They are, and we address all of those things. In fact, I'm very sensitive to the increasing concerns on the part of parents and grandparents, because our children are being catechized every single day by the culture. And we in the church, frankly, have just not responded well to this at all. We're not catechizing our children anymore in the Christian faith. And we're neglecting this, again, in a culture that is aggressively catechizing our children. So one of the things that we do for all of our Colson Fellows is we've partnered with Axis, and we provide them a wonderful resource through Axis called the Culture Translator.
Perfect.
Which really gives parents and grandparents insight into youth culture and the ideas, philosophies that are being transmitted, generated in youth culture.
Great.
Such that we're often unaware of and oblivious to. And then when you dive into these, you go, oh my goodness, what is going on? What are my kids learning? And what are the means through which they're learning, which would shock most parents.
So again, those are some resources that people can find at the Colson Center. And again, back to the question that Rob asked just a minute ago, it's difficult for people to be optimistic in this culture. And I had somebody, when we were just out last week speaking to some of the individuals, and the guy pulled me aside and said, okay, you got to explain this to me, because you talk about all sorts of negative things here on Point of View every day, and yet you seem to be very optimistic. And I think part of it is to put it in perspective. This is not the first time Christians have had to deal with a culture coming against them. In fact, our culture in the 21st century is getting to look more like the first century, and Christianity thrived in the midst of that. And so in some respects, we just need to make sure that we aren't just looking horizontally, because that will get us depressed, to look vertically and get us blessed, but also to see our place in history. And that's an important part of that as well, isn't it?
Yeah, and I would clarify that my optimism follows hope.
Yes.
And my hope is in the fact that our God reigns. Christ is king. He is ruling and reigning. None of this is a surprise. None of this shocks him. But he does have expectations for his people, and he commands us to what? Seek first his kingdom. And I think many of us today really don't understand what that means, because, one, we may not even understand what is meant by the kingdom. Is that heaven? Is that the church? Is it here? Is it not? Is it something that is an entirely future reality? Has it come and coming and one day is fully come? And there are answers to all those questions. The fact of the matter is the kingdom has come. It is coming, and it is relentless in its coming. It is unstoppable. The gates of hell cannot defend against the kingdom of God, right? They cannot prevail, and it's a defensive weapon, gates. Meaning the kingdom is coming against hell, and hell can't stop it.
I just love that. Again, if you find yourself saying, I want to learn a little bit more, of course, we have a link to colsonfellows.org. Of course, we also have a link as well to the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. And also included just a freebie there, and that is I found an interview that was done with Michael Craven called Worldview and You. It was done a while back, and it was just kind of fun to have a chance to hear him. Of course, if you'd like to see some of the other things he's written, here's some of the other interviews, you can find that at the Colson Center. So I'll just drop in a little bit there so if people can hear you in other different venues. And thank you so very much for coming in the studio today.
My pleasure. Always good.
And what we're going to be doing tomorrow, interesting enough, is a weekend edition. You've been part of that roundtable. We need to get you back on that roundtable, but tomorrow Penna Dexter will be sitting in there. She looks pretty good in that chair. And then we'll also have Dr. Merrill Matthews, so we'll cover a lot of issues. And you recognize what we'll be talking about. Probably most of our time and attention will be on Ukraine, but we'll also kind of looking ahead to a couple of other issues. Love to get some thoughts around the table about what is happening this week and what has been happening this week, and maybe even some thoughts briefly about the State of the Union address since that happened this week. But we're going to be looking ahead because there's a lot to focus our time and attention on. So I appreciate the fact that these two experts with us will really give us some perspective on that as well. I want to thank Andrew for his help as an engineer, Steve for his help as a producer. I hope that you will join us tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas recently said, "The Declaration of Independence has weathered every storm for 245 years. It birthed a great nation. It abolished the sin of slavery, and it endeavored to address its effects. While we have failed the Declaration time and again, and the ideals of the Declaration time and again, I know of no time," said Thomas, "when the ideals have failed us." While some see our founding as fatally flawed and promote ideas that have failed every time they've been tried, at Point of View, like Justice Thomas, we still believe in America's ideals. And if you do too, make a difference today. Join the Truth Team as we promote the unchanging truth that gave us liberty and prosperity. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The original Americans responded to the call. Will you? Pointofview.net/team and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.